It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Hey there, welcome, thanks for watching. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this massive 68-inch diameter table, which is 2 inches thick, made from spalted white oak, and has this pearl, cloudy, icy effect in the epoxy, which I love. Now, I had some major issues with this. I needed lots of scotch to get through this build, and I'm going to show you all the problems I had, including this almost 13-gallon epoxy leak I had. Yeah, quite a nightmare. So, I'll show you all the mistakes I made, and hopefully you can learn from mine. Alright, so first things first. Once you're able to get this thing inside your shop, sorry I don't have any footage of that. I was working by myself and I could barely handle this as it was. But now, let's get it cut down so we can fit it into the mold. I'm attaching this screw here. This will help me identify the center point that I'm planning to use when I do the outline of the circle. Now the second challenge I had was I didn't have a jig large enough to cut a perfect circle accurately. So I'm having to improvise with this Festool track. And the results were okay. Not really what I wanted, but it got the job done. Now it goes without saying, but there's rarely any redos when cutting wood. So just take your time here, measure twice, cut once, or whatever they say. Now, it's pretty obvious. You can see I'm starting to fight this a little bit. This is not a great setup. I don't recommend doing this. Again, I got the results I wanted, but it was definitely more painful than it needed to be. Also, I should point out here, I'm not doing a full plunge cut here. I'm doing maybe ½ an inch, a quick pass. This way I can come back with a much easier tool to use, the Jigsaw. It'll make life much better, trust me. Speaking of Jigsaw, here I'm using my ancient 30+ year old Jigsaw. I don't think it's that old, but it's probably close to my age. Anyway, my father gave it to me as a hand-me-down, and it served its purpose over the years. I'm super grateful and thankful that I had a father that helped me get into woodworking by giving me tools to get started. But I had to go out and get a new one, so I ran to the big box store and got a replacement. Just a quick tip when using a jigsaw. Don't force it through the material. Let the machine and the blade do the cutting. In the long run, this is going to be a lot easier on your hands and your wrists. Trust me. Now at this point, I've got my mold ready to go. I didn't put this in the video just because the length would have been a little too long, and frankly, I didn't want to bore you. But there were some good tips and tricks I learned from cutting such a large mold, which I will pass on in a separate video later. So on my one bad leg, I'm trying to get all the pieces into position and lay it out to get the best look possible. In order to get this piece into the mold and have it look as natural as possible, I use this already occurred split to divide it in half. Instead of using a saw or something like that, which would have given it a very unnatural manufactured look when I went to pour the epoxy. The next challenge I had was trying to get this perfectly cut and have these smaller pieces have a natural rounded edge to them as much as possible. So grabbing my Festool track again and improvising here, I relocated it back where I drilled that center earlier, which marked my true center for the table, and just used a piece of chalk, kind of held it up against the Festool track and walked around and marked the pieces. This way I would know where to cut them approximately and get the achieved final diameter that I was looking for. Now, like I mentioned earlier, having those straight, unnatural looks to these pieces of wood just gives it a very weird appearance. So in order to kind of combat that, it's not perfect, but I try to take my angle grinder with a wire wheel and I'll just scuff up the edges and mark it up and kind of gouge it a little bit here and there just to give it a somewhat natural look. It's not perfect, but it's better than just having those straight, smooth lines. And if anybody's watching this and has any tips or tricks for me for this point, just let me know in the comment section. Like I said, I'm always looking to get better at these things. And if you're also watching and wouldn't mind, hit the subscribe or like button. I greatly appreciate it. It'll help me create more content like this and just hone my skills even further. So thanks in advance. You might be asking what I'm doing here, but I'm just mixing some fast drying epoxy to seal the edges of all the pieces. That way, when I go to pour the main epoxy, the likelihood for bubbles will be a lot less. Now, I want you to pay attention to what I'm doing here. I'm spraying the mold release on the mold, getting ready for the wood to be put into place. And there's a couple reasons why I decided to do it in this sequence. But what I didn't realize is that I would be screwing myself later. Remember that leak in the beginning I teased you with? Well, yeah, this is why. And I'll explain again later in detail. Now, in my infinite wisdom and ultimate intelligence, this is why I sprayed the mold release. I was thinking to get the piece of wood into the mold without the edging in place would have been easiest. I couldn't put the edging on first, then the wood. I just couldn't lift it vertically to get it into place. I didn't have a helper. Now, the smart thing would have been to not do it this way and just get a helper, but yeah, so mistakes happened. And for anybody that's confused about what I'm saying here, because I sprayed the mold release before doing the edge with the caulk didn't have a chance to dry to the melamine first. So there was no bond there, and when I went to pour the epoxy, it just leaked right underneath the caulk. Now, in order to make this mold, as you can see, I'm just applying a bead of caulk to the edge of the melamine, and then I'm going to press the landscape edging up against that to get a nice firm seal. After that, I'll drive some screws in, make sure it stays in place. Now, this was what I was going to do in theory. In practicality, I screwed it up, as I've already talked about. And if you want more detail about these forms that I make, I'll probably make a separate video, so I don't want to go into too much detail here. Otherwise, the length of this video would be way too long. You guys would get bored and turn off. At this point in the process, it's time to mix up some epoxy. This is 12 gallons, or about 40 liters. I gotta redo that math. I don't think it's 40 liters. I think it's a little bit more, but anyway. This is a deep pour. Because of the thickness of the project, you definitely want to use a deep pour or something this big. And just take your time mixing this up. I'll provide links below for the exact product that I'm using. And to add on to that, I'm using eye candy pigment here. The shoji color is exactly what I'm using. This is what the customer picked out, and I highly recommend their stuff. It's very compatible with epoxy, and it's very high quality stuff. So anytime you're doing a pour, just take your time. You don't want to make a mess. This stuff is expensive, and it can be annoying to clean up, especially if it sets too long. The good thing about the deep pour epoxies out there, they're very liquidy, like water almost, and they level out very easily. On top of that, the air bubbles generally are pretty minimal as compared to something a little thicker, and they're easier to get out. A lot of them just end up popping on their own. Another piece of advice for beginners, as myself, I also was a beginner, and I should have just poured a little bit of epoxy first, and then let it set, and then come back, and then pour more. That way, if there had been a leak, I would have only lost a little bit and it didn't lose almost the entire 12 gallons. As I get experience, especially with these types of molds, this size, I just didn't have the confidence to do it, and I probably should have listened to myself in hindsight.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
So, There you go. As you can see, I'm frantically trying to plug this leak as it started out very slowly and just continued to grow and grow and grow. And every time I thought I had it under control, it just kept leaking out. I was applying more Tyvek tape. I was putting plastic wrap, duct tape. I mean, everything you could think of I was trying to throw at this. Even hot glue at one point, and it just wasn't working. Nothing was working. So I ended up getting it as best as I could, and then I threw in the towel and went to bed, hoping for the best overnight. And here's what I woke up to. As you can see underneath, that's all epoxy in that plastic wrap I laid under to catch any drips. Yeah, it's totally completely filled. I have about 2 to 3 gallons left in the mold itself. Thank God. I did save some of it was saved, but it's just a total mess. And I even cleaned up a lot of this before I started filming. There was towels and towels of epoxy that I had cleaned up. So yeah, what a freaking mess. There's my half-ass patch job you can see with all the plastic wrap and Tyvek. It literally did nothing. So at this point, I'm going to end the video. There's still a lot more to go, and I don't want to try to cram it all into one long video. I'd rather have a couple smaller, quicker videos. That way you guys don't get too bored of me and just click off. I still have to do a lot of planing. I got to do a lot of surfacing, sanding. I got to cut this thing down to a circle. I got to apply the finish and attach the legs. So there's a lot more to follow. And if you're watching this far, I do appreciate it. Hopefully you stay tuned to part 2 where I finish this thing once and for all. This thing came out pretty nice in the end, if I may say so myself, and the customer was very happy with it. So, yeah, stay tuned, and thanks again for watching. I appreciate it. Take care.